Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a world of quiet footsteps and clashing swords, to the age when Japan's warriors ruled from wooden halls smelling of incense and steel. This is a story not of the men who carried blades, but of the women who carried everything else: the fear, the silence, the rules, and the invisible weight of honor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already tucked in, just whisper where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the late 1500s. The air smells faintly of pine and smoke. Paper lanterns sway in corridors lined with tatami mats. Outside, somewhere beyond the garden walls, a night bird calls. You sit on your knees, adjusting your kimono, as your husband, a samurai of modest rank, prepares for a journey. His armor glints softly in the candlelight. The sound of metal plates brushing together echoes faintly like the ticking of time itself. He bows once, curtly, because affection is not part of ceremony. You bow lower, your forehead nearly touching the straw floor. Your world is not about love. It's about form, about duty, about silence. Feudal Japan wasn't kind to anyone, but if you were born a samurai's wife, your existence was shaped by 1,000 invisible laws. You had to know your place. Every step, every word, every glance mattered. The wrong tone at dinner could be seen as disrespect. The wrong gift, a social crime. The wrong smile, a threat to your family's face. And yet, behind those gestures of humility, there was a kind of quiet strength. The world outside glorified your husband's sword, but inside the house, you were the one holding it all together, from arranging alliances to calming rival wives. Historians still argue whether the average samurai wife felt oppressed or simply adapted with quiet pride. Some diaries suggest they saw it as their sacred duty. Others reveal deep loneliness and resignation, the kind that doesn't scream. It just lingers like incense smoke that never leaves the room. Outside, the world hums with the rhythm of change. Lords rise and fall. Castles burn and are rebuilt. But within the wooden walls of a samurai's home, time stands still. Your morning begins before sunrise. You oversee servants, check the rice stores, ensure your husband's clothes are mended, the inkstone ground, the armor polished. It's a choreography as rigid as any battlefield drill. But unlike the battlefield, your war has no songs, no banners, no victory. Only expectations and silence. As you kneel to light the household lamp, a thought drifts across your mind, a question whispered too quietly even for yourself. What if you were born free? You don't finish it. The idea is too large, too foreign, too dangerous. Instead, you pour tea. Perfectly. A single drop spills over the rim of the cup. You wipe it before anyone can notice. Perfection, in your world, is not a virtue. It's survival. From the outside, the samurai family looked noble and serene. But serenity often hides exhaustion. The same code that demanded loyalty from warriors demanded obedience from their wives. Absolute, unquestioned, endless. Even laughter had to be polite. Even sorrow had to bow. If you've ever wondered what it means to live inside a poem that's been folded into an iron cage, this was it. Still, there's beauty here too. The soft rustle of silk. The faint scent of plum blossoms sneaking through the shoji doors. The elegance of restraint. Because even suffering in Japan's old codes had to look graceful. The Heian poets centuries before wrote of moonlight, longing, and etiquette, and though their world had passed, their ghosts still lingered in every syllable you spoke. You lived between those words, half devotion, half disappearance. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, imagine yourself walking barefoot across that tatami floor. Feel the smooth fibers beneath your feet. Hear the faint creak of the wooden beam above. And know that somewhere, 500 years ago, another woman walked that same slow path, her thoughts hidden behind a paper wall, her story waiting centuries to be told. Now, take a breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The candles flicker, the night deepens, and the story is just beginning. Because the worst and the most fascinating parts of her life are still to come. In feudal Japan, marriage wasn't a matter of hearts meeting under cherry blossoms. It was a chess move, a silent negotiation between families who measured honor like coin. If you were a samurai's daughter, your life's direction was chosen before you learned to write your own name. You didn't marry for affection, you married for alignment. Your father might call it strategy. You might call it the end of your own story before it began. The day of your engagement would arrive with the same stillness as a snowstorm. No excitement, no fanfare, just a messenger kneeling, delivering a scroll sealed with family crests, a contract of futures traded like rice and land. You would read the name of your husband-to-be and feel nothing, because feeling something was not required. If his clan had land, influence, or soldiers, that was what mattered. Love was an unnecessary luxury, a rumor from the West that hadn't yet sailed across the sea. Historians still debate how much personal choice women truly had in these alliances. Some argue that highborn women sometimes influenced such unions through subtle counsel. Others insist the idea of choice is an illusion, that even consent itself was just another ritual, as choreographed as a vow. Your mother would have reminded you, a woman's voice is strongest when it's silent but wise. And so you bowed and agreed, and packed your life into a lacquered chest lined with silk and prayers. Your wedding would be a whisper, not a celebration. You would walk into your new home beneath a white hood, wataboshi, symbol of obedience and purity. It covered your head not for modesty, but to hide the horns of jealousy women were believed to carry. People smiled politely as you entered, but behind their folded fans, they were measuring your worth. Your beauty was irrelevant. Your behavior was currency. And from that day on, you ceased to belong to your father's clan, or even to yourself. You became the property of another house, a living extension of their reputation. In the silence of your new chamber, you would trace the family crest embroidered on your robe. Maybe 3 hollyhock leaves, or wisteria vines curling in gold thread. You might whisper your maiden name under your breath, just once, to remember it. Outside, the garden would rustle with bamboo. Inside, you'd feel like one of its stalks, upright, bending but never allowed to break. Your husband, meanwhile, would spend his days training, drinking, or reading the Bushido Code aloud, as if it were scripture. He might nod to you at meals. He might not. If he were kind, he would treat you with formal courtesy. If he were not, you would learn to smile anyway, because complaint was dishonor, and dishonor was unforgivable. There were wives who found tiny pockets of joy, poetry circles, calligraphy lessons, tea ceremonies where laughter could be disguised as grace. But even then, every pleasure came with an invisible warning. Don't stand out. Don't speak too loudly. Don't forget who you serve. Sometimes you'd catch a glimpse of another couple, perhaps peasants, laughing freely by the river, their love unconcerned with bloodlines or ceremony. You'd wonder if that freedom felt as light as it looked. But the thought would pass quickly. You'd straighten your kimono and remind yourself, this is the path chosen for me. Because in this world, freedom was a myth, and acceptance was the only kind of peace allowed. Historians often point out the irony that the samurai's wife, though bound by silence, was also a guardian of lineage. Without her, the bloodline couldn't continue. Without her, the code meant nothing. And yet, her name rarely appeared in records. Her voice was inked out of history like a mistake on parchment. Still, her hands, unseen, held empires of duty together. Every alliance, every peace treaty, every generation of warriors owed something to a woman who bowed in silence and obeyed. So, as you drift now into that stillness, picture the ceremony again. The paper lanterns glowing like captive stars. The faint scent of incense and sake. The rustle of silk as two families' destinies intertwined. You're not marrying a man. You're marrying a system. And that system demands your silence. But the worst of it, the real test of obedience and patience, was still to come. Because after the vows came the daily life that tested them, hour by hour. And that is where tomorrow begins. Silence. That was your truest skill. You learned it before you learned to read, how to listen without reacting, how to speak without moving lips, how to breathe without being noticed. Because in your new home, silence was the language of survival. The samurai's wife was expected to be serene, composed, invisible when needed, but always observant. Your beauty mattered less than your restraint. Your charm was measured in the distance between your thoughts and your tone. The morning began with rituals. You woke before dawn, brushed your hair 100 strokes, tied it with quiet precision, and moved softly through the tatami corridors so the servants would not see your shadow as impatience. Every gesture was an act of training. Every breath, a ceremony. You bowed to your mother-in-law before you spoke. You bowed to your husband when he entered, and again when he left. And even when you ate, you bowed to the rice bowl, for food, too, was hierarchy. Historians often say that in feudal Japan, silence was not oppression, but a kind of music, the rhythm of social harmony. But others argue that harmony was just another word for obedience, a poetic disguise for control. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. To live among the warrior class meant performing peace in a world built on violence. You couldn't swing a sword, but you could wield calmness like armor. If your husband returned angry from the Lord's command, your silence was the shield that kept the house intact. Still, that silence had weight. There were moments when you wished to shout, to say I'm tired, or I'm lonely, or I hate this cold room and your cold rituals. But you'd swallow the words with tea, the bitterness hiding beneath the sweetness of matcha. At night, when the candles guttered low, you might whisper poems into the dark, the way caged birds hum to themselves. Lines like, "The moon knows what I dare not say. It glows even when unseen." You'd press your palm against the tatami and imagine the centuries of women before you who'd done the same, each one holding the house together by pretending not to exist. In this world, you were expected to master shitsuke, discipline in all things. If you wept, your tears must not stain the kimono. If you laughed, your voice must not rise above your husband's. If you disagreed, you must find a way to seem grateful for correction. The great philosopher Kaibara Ekin wrote Ana Daiku, the greater learning for women, sometime in the early 18th century, but its spirit had long existed. It taught that a woman's virtue was in her obedience, that her greatest weapon was submission. Historians still debate whether it reflected true belief or merely enforced it, whether women embraced that code or endured it quietly. You might not know the word patriarchy, but you lived it, embroidered into your sleeves and whispered in your prayers. Yet even in silence, there was skill. You learned how to read a man's posture before he spoke, how to tell when an argument was brewing and diffuse it before it began. You could sense tension in the way chopsticks clicked against a bowl or how sake was poured too quickly. You were the unseen strategist, the diplomat behind paper screens, the one who could stop a feud with a wordless glance or start one with a misplaced smile. In quieter moments, you might watch the world from your veranda. The garden stones were arranged like an old poem, their placement deliberate, their stillness eternal. You wondered if that was what your life looked like from above, perfectly balanced, utterly motionless. A dragonfly would hover near the koi pond, its wings trembling with effort. And for a moment, you'd envy its freedom, until you realized even it was bound by air, by hunger, by the season. Everything, it seemed, obeyed something, but sometimes silence could be its own rebellion. When gossip spread through the household, you stayed quiet. When your husband's relatives tested your patience, you smiled faintly, revealing nothing. When someone expected tears, you gave them calm. In a world obsessed with control, your calmness became power. It unsettled those who expected weakness. And though they'd never say it aloud, some of them feared you, the woman who could feel deeply but reveal nothing. The art of silent duty was not simply about obedience. It was about mastering the self, the heart, the face, the voice. It was about surviving inside a structure built to contain you, and somehow finding a secret rhythm of your own. So, as you lie in the quiet now, imagine yourself kneeling in that room once more, lantern light flickering against the walls. Outside, snow begins to fall, muffling the world. And in that soft, white silence, you find peace not in freedom, but in endurance. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the only sound left that doesn't betray you. The house of a samurai was a world within walls, wooden ribs and paper skin, fragile enough that a strong wind could rearrange the air. From the outside, it seemed elegant. Sliding doors, raked gravel gardens, calm ponds reflecting perfect skies. But from within, it was a labyrinth of rules and whispers. The home wasn't yours. It belonged to the family name, a miniature fortress where even silence had rank. Every morning, you rose before the rooster, wrapped yourself in layers of silk, and checked the small altars of the household gods. A pinch of rice for prosperity, a bow to the ancestors, a murmured wish for peace. Then came the endless duties. Servants lined up awaiting instructions. Rice needed sorting, armor needed polishing. Guest rooms required checking in case your husband's lord decided to arrive unannounced. You were the general of a domestic battlefield, but your commands had to sound like suggestions. Power expressed softly, through folded hands and measured smiles. To the untrained eye, a samurai home might seem quiet, almost serene. But behind the shoji doors, dozens of tasks collided in secret choreography. A servant girl swept the tatami with a straw broom. Another refilled the lamps with oil, careful not to spill. You could hear the faint sound of sandals scraping across wood, like whispers carried by wind. You didn't shout orders. You moved through the rooms like a ghost, and things simply happened. You became the rhythm the house followed. And in that quiet authority, there was both pride and exhaustion. Historians often wonder if samurai wives felt trapped or empowered by their domestic responsibilities. Some records describe women managing entire estates during wartime, collecting taxes, negotiating with peasants, organizing defenses. Others paint them as delicate shadows, existing only to pour tea. The truth likely depended on the woman, the family, and the century. But either way, her life was lived beneath beams heavy with duty. There were small joys, too. The scent of incense curling in the morning air. The sound of rain pattering gently on paper roofs. The moment when your husband left, and you could breathe a little deeper. Sometimes you sat by the veranda, repairing the laces of his armor, silk cords running through your fingers like veins of duty. You'd wonder what battles those laces had seen. You'd wonder what blood they'd touched. And sometimes, you'd wonder why the gods made metal for men and silence for women. Inside the kitchen, life smelled of miso and smoke. You'd stand by the iron kettle, stirring rice as the fire popped and crackled. It was a simple ritual, but sacred in its way. Nourishment as devotion. Every meal carried layers of meaning. A poorly prepared dish could shame the household. A burned pot could be read as neglect. And so, you stirred with precision, as though your soul depended on the rhythm of the spoon. In the afternoons, when the chores slowed, you'd sit by the tatami edge and embroider small cranes or cherry blossoms into a kimono hem. Your needle dipped in and out of the fabric like the passage of time. Quiet, repetitive, infinite. Outside, cicadas droned, marking the heat of summer. Inside, The house hummed with the faint buzz of obligation. Your world was small, but it pulsed with invisible effort, the kind of effort no one praised because no one saw. Sometimes, in the lull of evening, you'd pause at the inner corridor and watch the faint reflection of your own face in a lacquered door. The woman looking back at you was graceful, patient, well-trained. But if you stared long enough, you could almost see another face beneath, the one that used to laugh too loudly, or dream of riding horses, or swim in the river before the wedding vows stole her name. You'd blink. The reflection would vanish. The perfect wife would remain. And as night fell, you'd light the lanterns again, their glow soft and warm like captured moons. Your husband's footsteps echoed outside, slow, heavy measured. You bowed as he entered, waited until he spoke, served his tea, and knelt silently beside him. The house exhaled around you. Everything in its place, everyone in their role. It was beauty, yes, but beauty that suffocated. Yet, in that suffocation, you found rhythm. And in rhythm, you found a strange peace, like waves that never change, like seasons that always return. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the creak of old wood, the sigh of paper screens, the steady flicker of lantern light. You are inside that house now, its walls breathing with memory, its silence alive with the footsteps of women long gone. And beyond those walls, the world waits, louder and harsher than you can yet imagine. But for now, just rest inside the wooden quiet. Steel ruled every part of your world, though not all blades were equal. Your husband's sword gleamed with legend and honor. Yours was small, practical, and rarely noticed. He carried his katana, curved and sacred, symbol of a warrior's soul. You carried a kitchen knife, straight, sharp, and ordinary. Yet both were instruments of survival. Each morning, you prepared the meal before the sun climbed over the tiled roofs. Fish, rice, miso soup, quiet sustenance for the man whose battles decided your fate. As you sliced vegetables, you might pause, staring at the edge of the blade. It caught the light like a whisper of danger. Steel can mean life, or death. And for samurai wives, the difference was sometimes just one decision. Historians often note that samurai women were trained in small weapons. Not for glory, for necessity. When husbands were away at war, wives were expected to defend the household. The tanto, a short dagger, rested in a hidden drawer near your bedding. You knew how to use it, not against armies, but against dishonor. If the home was breached, you were expected to fight until death, or die by your own hand rather than be captured. That blade, smaller than your palm, was both a promise and a threat. But there was another knife, one rarely mentioned, the one used for jigai, ritual suicide for women, where men plunged their swords into the abdomen in seppuku. Women cut the throat cleanly to preserve the body's posture. The ritual demanded calmness, elegance, even a final bow in steel. It sounds grim now, but to them, it was devotion, a death chosen in dignity rather than humiliation. Historians still argue whether many women truly performed jigai, or whether the fear of it alone kept them obedient. Either way, the blade on your shelf was as much a part of your marriage as your vows. In quieter moments, you watched your husband polish his katana. He'd sit cross-legged, sliding the oiled cloth along the curved edge, every motion slow, reverent, almost spiritual. That sword was his pride, his identity, his God. You'd watch the light dance on the metal and think, it reflects him better than I ever could. When he left for war, the sword went with him. You remained behind with your smaller steel and endless waiting. Sometimes you imagine the two blades speaking in whispers across the miles. One stained with glory, one hidden in shame. There's a story, perhaps myth, perhaps not, of a samurai wife who kept her husband's broken sword after he fell in battle. She melted it down, reforged it into kitchen knives, and used them for the rest of her life. Each meal she prepared was a ritual of mourning, each cut a prayer. Historians debate whether she existed, but you can almost picture her, kneeling by the hearth, eyes soft, every motion a remembrance. For women of your station, survival was a craft of subtle tools. The knife was one, the brush another. You learned that words, too, could cut, the wrong ones deeply, the right ones precisely. To soothe a lord's temper, to comfort servants, to calm a rival wife. Each required surgical precision. And like steel, once words left your mouth, they could not be undone. At dusk, you often sharpened your knife against a whetstone. The sound, steady, rhythmic, echoed faintly through the hall. Your husband might hear it from another room, mistaking it for domestic diligence. He would never imagine the thoughts that hummed beneath that sound. Maybe you weren't sharpening it for violence. Maybe you were simply claiming one small piece of control, a reminder that even in a silent home, you held a fragment of power. The duality of your life was sharp as the blades themselves. To the world, you were gentleness, sewing, cooking, bowing. Inside, you were tempered steel. Like the sword, you endured heat, pressure, and endless shaping. Like the sword, you gleamed most quietly when the fire faded. Tonight, as you drift into the stillness of that era, imagine the glow of a single lantern flickering against steel. One blade lies long and curved, destined for fame. The other rests small and plain, destined for anonymity. But both hold the same cold truth. That survival, whether in battle or in silence, always has an edge. And the samurai wife knew this better than anyone. There was a book that every noblewoman was expected to know, Anna Daigaku, The Greater Learning for Women. Written in the early 1700s by the Confucian scholar Kaibara Eken, it served as both a rule book and a warning. You didn't read it for inspiration. You read it for survival. The book told you how to speak, how to sit, how to obey. It told you that a woman must look upon her husband as upon heaven itself. It told you that your loyalty to your father must transfer completely to your husband, and when he died, to your son. There was no line in which your soul belonged only to you. Even if you never saw the book, its words surrounded you. They were recited by elder women, whispered by servants, embroidered into the household's moral fabric. You could almost feel them written in invisible ink across your sleeves. Obedience, purity, endurance. Historians debate how strictly samurai wives followed those teachings. Some scholars suggest it was more ideal than practice, a philosophy used to keep order. Others insist it shaped every breath women took. But whether or not you followed the book literally, it was the ghost in the room, present at every meal, every silence, every bow. Your daily life was built on that hierarchy. Your husband answered to his lord. You answered to your husband, and the servants answered to you. But even that authority was a performance. You couldn't scold too harshly. That would make you cruel. You couldn't show pity. That would make you weak. So you ruled through balance. The same delicate balance expected of a samurai on the battlefield, except your battlefield was made of etiquette and glances. There's an old saying, the sword controls the body, the code controls the mind. For women, the code was heavier than steel. If a husband struck you, it wasn't cruelty, it was discipline. If he took another woman, it wasn't betrayal, it was his right. If you disobeyed, even once, you risked exile from both families, a living ghost with nowhere to belong. Your obedience was not measured in actions alone. It was measured in how quickly you forgave, how quietly you endured, and how gracefully you pretended not to notice. And yet, within that obedience, there were layers of subtle rebellion. You might delay answering a command by pretending not to hear. You might suggest an idea as though it came from someone else. You might control the servants with such quiet skill that your husband believed the house ran by magic. This was the secret art of survival, ruling through invisibility. The Anna Daigaku advised wives to avoid idle talk, warning that gossip leads to ruin. But in truth, gossip was often the only power women possessed. between the quiet rooms of neighboring estates. Messages traveled faster than soldiers. You learned how to listen without seeming to listen, to trade favors disguised as compliments. Behind those paper walls, diplomacy lived in whispers. Sometimes, when you walked through the garden, you'd wonder whether the koi in the pond were freer than you. They swam in circles, their paths predetermined by stone and water, yet they looked serene. Maybe obedience, like the pond, could be beautiful when seen from above. Or maybe beauty was just another mask. Historians still argue about how much women accepted these roles. Some diaries from the Edo period show genuine devotion, wives who took pride in their husband's success and their household harmony. Others hint at quiet despair, masked by calligraphy and prayer. The truth, perhaps, is that obedience became its own kind of art, a performance learned so deeply it became instinct. At night, when everyone else slept, you'd kneel before the household altar. The candlelight flickered over your folded hands. You'd whisper thanks for peace, for health, for another day without disgrace. And in that whisper, there might be another prayer, small or hidden. A little freedom, perhaps tomorrow. But even that prayer was silent. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself bowing one last time before the unseen code. The paper walls glow faintly in the lamplight. The pond outside reflects a pale moon. And you, so still, so quiet, seem carved from the same calm as the world itself. You might not believe in the rules. You might not even agree with them. But you live within them perfectly because in this house, survival wears the mask of obedience. The first sign wasn't the sound of drums. It was the silence that followed. Servants whispering less. Messengers arriving more often. A tension in the air, thin as a bowstring. War had returned, and even though the battlefield was far away, it bled quietly into every room of your home. Your husband's armor, normally stored like a relic, was suddenly everywhere. The plates spread out for polishing, the cords retied, the lacquered helmet placed on a stand like a sleeping god. You knelt beside it, your hands moving automatically, rethreading the silk ties, smoothing the surface. You didn't need to be told what it meant. A campaign was coming, and you, though you wouldn't fight, would feel every strike. You packed his travel chest yourself. Rice balls wrapped in bamboo leaves. Dried fish, a small charm of protection, sewn secretly into the lining. He didn't need to know. You weren't supposed to be sentimental. When he mounted his horse, you stood in the courtyard, back straight, head lowered. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. A warrior's farewell was not a moment for softness. The gate closed behind him with the sound of finality. And then the world changed. Historians write that the Sengoku and Edo periods often blurred the boundary between home and battlefield. While men fought, women ran estates, managed food supplies, and cared for wounded soldiers returning from distant fronts. In some households, women even trained in spear fighting, naginata, to defend their homes if enemies came. But for most wives, the war arrived not with swords, but with absence. The absence of footsteps, of laughter, of certainty. The echo of a life paused indefinitely. You were told to remain calm, to be the pillar of the house. The servants looked to you for direction. The children watched your face for signs. You smiled, softly, as if nothing was wrong. But inside, your heart counted days like prayer beads. Each morning, you knelt at the household altar and lit a stick of incense. The smoke curled upward, slow, fragile, beautiful, like the hope you barely dare to feel. Some wives received letters sealed with their husband's crest, smelling faintly of ink and dust. Others received nothing but silence. You learned to listen to silence the way men listen to the sound of arrows. One night, the wind rattled the paper doors. You thought you heard a horse outside and ran to the gate, only to find snow falling untouched. The sound had been a dream. The horse belonged to your longing. You closed the gates softly and whispered, "Come home soon," though no one was there to hear. Sometimes the war crept closer. Rumors of bandits, deserters, or fires reached the estate. You moved the servants to guard the granary, hid the children in the interior rooms. You might even keep the dagger near your pillow, not from fear of strangers, but from the knowledge of what might be required if defeat came. Because losing wasn't just about dying. It was about dishonor, and that was worse. Historians still argue whether the samurai wife lived in terror or simply adapted. Some accounts suggest they were remarkably calm, even stoic, as if war was just another household routine. Others hint at suppressed panic, sleepless nights, quiet tears, long hours staring at unfinished embroidery because the needle couldn't distract the mind. You could imagine both being true, because fear, like silence, has many shapes. Weeks turned to months. The world outside went on. Plum trees blossomed, children grew taller, and the sun kept rising. You carried on too, as though your heartbeat was just another chore. You smiled at festivals, recited the right prayers, and looked at the horizon each dusk, wondering whether it held your future or your end. When letters finally came, they were brief. A few lines of formal gratitude, a mention of honor, perhaps a request for supplies. Never affection, never longing. So you folded the paper carefully, bowed to it as one bows to a shrine, and placed it in a wooden box beside the altar. It was the only trace of him you were allowed to keep. And when news came of deaths, other men, other wives, you'd feel both guilt and relief. Guilt for surviving, relief that your door hadn't been the one the messenger knocked on. Every knock became an omen. Every sound from the road, a pulse of dread. And yet, you waited. You kept the house alive. You lit the lamps. You held the silence steady because someone had to. So tonight, as the night deepens and your breathing slows, imagine that same flicker of fear glowing behind paper walls. The armor gleams faintly in the corner, a shadow of devotion. The air smells of smoke and pine. Somewhere far away, drums roll like thunder. But you stay still, because for the samurai wife, stillness was its own kind of bravery. When war steals a husband, words become your only bridge. And that bridge was made of ink. Each evening, after the lamps were lit and the house fell quiet, you knelt before a low table with brush and paper. The smell of ink filled the air, smoky, sharp, familiar. You ground the ink stick slowly, letting it pool into the inkstone like a gathering storm. Then, with a breath, you began to write. The first lines were always formal. To my honorable husband, may your sword remain true. But beneath the polite phrases, your heart spilled through the brush. You wanted to say, I miss you, but there was no such phrase in your vocabulary. Instead, you wrote about the weather, the harvest, the new silk robe you were sewing. Every word was a disguise for longing. Historians say that samurai letters followed a strict etiquette, more report than affection. But between the brushstrokes, you could see what was never spoken, the hesitation in the ink, the slight tremor of emotion even discipline couldn't erase. You would pause, lift the brush, and listen to the rain tapping on the paper doors. How far was he? Was he reading under the same kind of light? Was his armor cold, his stomach empty, his heart still loyal? You smiled faintly at your own thoughts. Love in your world had to hide behind metaphors. So you wrote instead. The plum blossoms opened early this year. Their fragrance lingers longer than I expected. He would understand. Or maybe not. Either way, it was all you could say. Sometimes you receive his replies, formal, brief, practical. Reports of supplies. Mentions of loyalty to his lord. A note about the health of the men. But once, you received a letter different from the rest. A single sheet, hastily written, the ink blotted in places as if from rain or tears. The sound of drums tonight reminds me of the wind through our garden. Tell the servants to prepare for spring. I will return when the mountain snow melts. You read it again and again until the words blurred. Then you folded it neatly and hid it under your pillow. There's a curious detail that scholars often overlook. the role of couriers, mostly peasants, who risked their lives to carry these letters. They rode through storms, through fields littered with arrows, through checkpoints where a single mistake could mean death. Sometimes they were captured. Sometimes the letters never arrived, which means history itself is filled with silences, words written but never read. Perhaps that's why you kept writing anyway, to fill that void, to keep your world from collapsing into absence. You'd watch the brush move, dark against white, the way life insists on leaving a mark even when no one sees it. You'd sign with the family crest, sprinkle a touch of incense, ash to scent the paper, and press your seal, a soft red circle, like a heartbeat left behind. Then you'd call the servant, bow slightly, and hand the letter over. For a moment, your fingers lingered on the folded paper, as though you could hold the distance still. Weeks would pass. You'd wait by the veranda at sunset, hoping to see a courier on the horizon. But often there was only wind. The garden rustled, indifferent to your waiting. The koi in the pond swam their silent circles, untroubled by human absence. Sometimes you whispered the letters aloud, pretending he was there to hear them. The sound of your own voice startled you. So rare, so private. It reminded you that silence had a taste, and you'd swallowed too much of it. Historians still argue whether samurai marriages had love in them at all. Some say affection grew quietly, like moss between stones. Others believe it was duty disguised as tenderness. But perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that you wrote, that the ink carried something human across the divide of war and expectation. Maybe that was the closest you could come to freedom, writing words no one could correct. When the courier finally returned one spring morning, you recognized the seal immediately. You broke it open with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat. The message was short. He was alive. That was all you needed to know. You bowed to the letter, placed it gently in the altar box beside the last one, and exhaled a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. Outside, plum blossoms drifted through the air, soft as the paper in your hand. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine that brush scratching softly on parchment. The scent of ink, the hush of the night, the candlelight trembling. Each stroke a heartbeat, each word a bridge. And though most of those bridges fell before they reached the other side, you kept building them, because even silence, when written carefully, could carry love. Honor. It was the invisible chain around every neck in the samurai world, shining, sacred, and impossibly heavy. Your husband carried it into battle. You carried it into every breath. For a samurai man, honor meant courage. For his wife, it meant perfection. You could never fail, never falter, never reveal cracks. Because one misstep, a rumor, a glance, a word, could destroy not only you but the generations before and after you. The word Mayo, honor, was more than virtue. It was identity. It decided who ate, who ruled, who was remembered. It was the invisible armor everyone wore, sharper than a sword, colder than winter wind. And you learned early that for women, honor was silence made visible. The way you walked, the way you bowed, the way you hid your pain so gracefully it looked like peace. One afternoon, a servant stumbled while carrying tea and spilled a few drops on your husband's sleeve. His face froze, a storm restrained by etiquette. You stepped forward immediately, bowing until your forehead touched the floor. You apologized for your servant's clumsiness, even though the mistake wasn't yours. Later, you quietly replaced the servant with another, not out of cruelty, but because one mistake, left uncorrected, reflected upon your entire house. Your compassion had to wear the mask of discipline. Historians debate whether this obsession with honor made Japanese society stronger or crueler. Some call it moral elegance, others psychological torture. For samurai wives, it was both. You might think of honor as glory, but for women, it was vigilance. You guarded your husband's name the way soldiers guarded a fortress. If gossip reached you, about his temper, his debts, his infidelity, you were expected to silence it, not by confrontation, but by flawless behavior. If the neighbors saw serenity in your eyes, they would assume your marriage was harmonious. If your smile never wavered, they would stop whispering. Your calmness became camouflage. In the inner rooms of the house, you managed the servants' tempers and rivalries like a general. A single argument overheard could tarnish the family's reputation. So you learned to discipline softly with words that cut like silk. Sometimes you'd scold gently. You must remember that our house breathes through your behavior. And the servant would bow so low you'd hear their forehead hit the mat. You didn't need to raise your voice. Power was quieter than that. But there were moments when honor turned from armor to blade. If your husband failed in war or fell out of favor with his lord, disgrace could spread like fire through paper walls. You could lose your status, your home, your servants, everything except your duty to appear composed. And if the shame was unbearable, you might be expected to join him in death. A G-guy performed not from despair, but from loyalty, because a wife without honor was considered already gone. It sounds distant now, a relic of another age, but imagine living with that constant shadow. The knowledge that your existence balanced on reputation, that your worth could vanish with a whisper. Historians note that even commoner women admired samurai wives for their restraint. They were seen as the embodiment of grace, poised, unwavering, controlled. But grace, in this world, came with exhaustion. Every smile was calculation. Every silence, performance. And somewhere beneath that perfect surface, you carried the ache of being unseen. Sometimes at night, you sat alone by the altar and wondered if honor was truly noble or just beautiful suffering. You'd think of the fireflies outside, glowing briefly before fading into the dark. Perhaps honor was like that, luminous, fragile, temporary. And yet, people would destroy their lives to keep its light alive. You couldn't say such things aloud, of course. So you said them to the night, and the night never answered. There's a haunting record from the Edo period, a diary written by a samurai's daughter. In one entry, she writes, "I'm praised for my calm. They say my silence is admirable, but silence is only peaceful when it is chosen." That single line has survived centuries because it said what most women couldn't. That endurance, when forced, becomes invisible suffering. Still, you woke each morning, adjusted your kimono, and faced another day of perfection. Not because you believed in the code, but because you had no choice. Because even if you doubted everything else, you still believed in your family's survival. And that too was honor. So, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the still air of that wooden house. A single candle burning low, your reflection soft in a lacquered bowl. Outside, a cicada hums like a tired prayer. You bow once, not to the code, not to your husband, but to yourself, for keeping the silence that history demanded. And though no one saw it, that quiet endurance was the purest form of courage. Love was a dangerous word in your world. Not forbidden, just misplaced. It belonged to poems, not people. If you were lucky, your husband was kind. If you were less lucky, he was simply indifferent. And if fortune truly turned, you'd find yourself sharing him, with women chosen not by affection, but by politics, pleasure, or lineage. Concubinage was not scandal. It was structure. Among samurai, a man could have multiple wives and lovers if his rank or wealth allowed it. Each woman had a defined place in the hierarchy, written as clearly as any law. You were the principal wife, saishitsu, the official keeper of the household. She was the meat-cake, the concubine, a shadow permitted by society, but rarely by your heart. When the new woman arrived, she would come dressed in her finest silk, bowing deeply before you. Her voice soft, her eyes lowered, her presence an echo of everything you could not say. You smiled because the code demanded it. You greeted her as custom required, offered tea, asked if her journey was comfortable. all while something quiet and sharp turned inside you. Historians still argue about how much jealousy existed between wives and concubines. Some records describe fierce rivalries, poison gossip, silent feuds, even suicides born of humiliation. Others show surprising tolerance, even friendship between women united by circumstance. But most agree on one thing. In that house, love was rationed like rice, carefully, strategically, never wasted. At night, when you heard your husband's footsteps pass your door and stop elsewhere, you would lie still, eyes open to the dark. The paper walls did nothing to hide the faint sounds, laughter, whispering, the shifting of silk. You turned your face to the wall, breathing slowly, waiting for it to end. You were not allowed to rage or cry, or even sulk. You were expected to embody serenity. But serenity is heavy when it's worn like armor. There's an old saying, the flower that blooms in the shade is the most fragrant. That was the consolation given to wives, that your virtue, your restraint, your dignity under pressure would outlast your rival's momentary favor. But in truth, you didn't care about poetry. You cared about silence. You cared about surviving the humiliation without letting it stain your face. Historians note that concubines often came from lower ranks, servants, entertainers, or widows of fallen samurai. Sometimes they were gifts from lords, meant to strengthen alliances. Sometimes they were taken in pity or convenience. And sometimes, quietly, they were loved. If you discovered such love, you couldn't confront it. That would expose weakness. So you fought invisibly, with kindness so perfect it stung, with politeness so flawless it suffocated. That was the true duel between women, a battle fought with gestures, not blades. Still, there were nights when you'd sit alone on the veranda and wonder what love really was. Was it duty performed gracefully, or rebellion disguised as tenderness? Did your husband ever see you, the person beneath the silk and silence, or only the role you played in the theater of honor? You traced the grain of the wooden floor with your fingertips, feeling the smoothness where countless feet had passed. Even wood remembers footsteps longer than men remember devotion. Sometimes a concubine bore a child before you did. That child might threaten your own position, yet by custom you were expected to smile and send gifts of congratulations. You'd bow to the infant as if bowing to fate itself. You could not hate the child. You could not hate the woman. So you turned all that unspoken ache inward, folding it neatly into silence until it became part of you. Historians find letters from wives who managed such lives with grace. Women who wrote that jealousy is like wind. It can be heard but not seen. Perhaps that was true. You learned to let it pass through you, leaving no trace. And yet, sometimes when you smelled your husband's robe after he returned from another room, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to it like memory. You didn't wash it away. You just folded it carefully and placed it back where it belonged, as if erasing the evidence would erase the ache. But jealousy has its own strange alchemy. Over time, it dulled into something quieter, almost tender. You began to pity the other woman, trapped as you were, bound by the same code, the same loneliness. You realized she too was acting a part, bowing, smiling, surviving. And that understanding, small, painful, human, became your freedom. So, as you rest now, imagine the paper lanterns glowing in different rooms of the same house. Each flame its own story, flickering, struggling, but refusing to die. You cannot own the fire. You can only keep it from burning you. And in that delicate balance between love and loss, jealousy and grace, the samurai wife found her quietest strength. When you finally held your child for the first time, the world seemed to still. A small cry, a fragile body, a heartbeat softer than the rustle of silk. You wanted to believe that this tiny creature belonged to you, that you could love without fear. But in a samurai house, even motherhood was not yours to claim. The midwife placed the baby in your arms, then quickly turned to bow toward the ancestor altar. The offering was immediate. Before you named your child, you gave thanks to the clan, because the baby wasn't yours. It belonged to the bloodline. A mother's love was expected, but ownership? Never. Historians describe samurai motherhood as a blend of duty and distance. Wives were often expected to produce heirs, but not necessarily to raise them. Infants were passed quickly to wet nurses or tutors, cared for according to rank and gender. If your child was a boy, he was trained early for war. If a girl, she was groomed for obedience. Either way, love had to wear the mask of formality. You were allowed affection only in moderation. Too much emotion was considered weakness, even dangerous. Children were not to be spoiled with warmth. They were to be shaped like bamboo into strength. There's a story told in the old court journals of a samurai wife who secretly visited her child's nursery each night. She'd stand silently by the door, watching the wet nurse cradle the baby. She never spoke, never touched him, never broke the rule. She just stood there until the oil lamp flickered out. In the morning, she returned to her duties as though nothing had happened. The servants pretended not to notice her red eyes. Historians still argue whether such restraint was noble or tragic. But you, standing in her place, would know it was both. The early years passed in a haze of ceremony. Every milestone, the child's first haircut, first writing lesson, first bow to the family shrine, was an event of precision. You smiled as the elders praised his form, his posture, his discipline. But when no one watched, you'd trace his sleeping face with your gaze, memorizing the softness before duty hardened him. You wanted to whisper, "Be free someday." But freedom wasn't a word you were supposed to teach. Sometimes you'd see other mothers in the village, laughing with their children, holding them openly. You'd envy their simplicity, the freedom to love without measuring it. But then you'd remind yourself, your son's future depended on reputation, not affection. If you were seen as too emotional, it might harm his standing. So you turned your tenderness inward, like folding a paper crane you couldn't release. Historians found letters written by samurai women to their grown sons. The tone was always restrained. Serve your lord with loyalty. Guard your honor. Bring no shame to the house. And yet, between the lines, there's warmth hidden in the ink. A tremor in the brushstroke. A pause where the hand lingered too long. Even when the words followed duty, the emotion refused to vanish. Because motherhood, like water, finds its way through every barrier. If your child died, as many did in those times, grief had to remain invisible. You dressed in subdued colors, spoke little, and continued your tasks. Your tears fell only during prayer, absorbed quietly by the tatami. You were expected to thank the gods for taking the child early, before dishonor could ever touch him. And yet, when the lanterns went out, your arms still remembered the weight they no longer held. As your children grew, they learned to bow before they learned to hug. They were polite, distant, reverent. Sometimes they even corrected your posture, evidence that the code had taken root. You smiled with pride, even as your heart ached for the closeness you'd traded for discipline. But perhaps that was the cruel genius of the samurai world. It taught you to love without touching, to care without clinging, to grieve without tears. One spring, when the plum trees bloomed, your son left for training. He bowed before you with perfect composure, a miniature reflection of his father. You wanted to hold him one last time. Instead, you straightened his collar, fixed a loose thread, and said only, "Serve well, and return with honor." He nodded, and was gone. You stayed at the gate long after his figure disappeared. The petals kept falling, soft as regrets you could never speak. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine those petals falling still. The faint scent of plum blossoms, the small hand you once held, and the sound of your own breath, steady and quiet, because a samurai mother does not cry, she endures. Somewhere in that endurance, love survives. Not loud, not seen, but eternal. Death did not release a samurai wife. It simply changed the way her silence sounded. When your husband died, in battle, by illness, or by his own blade, the world didn't allow you to collapse. You were not permitted to wail or tear your robes. Grief had to follow the same order as life: dignified, quiet, controlled. The morning the news came, a messenger arrived at the gate. He bowed deeply, said nothing at first, then handed over a folded letter sealed in black wax. You already knew. Your knees weakened, but you didn't fall. Instead, you bowed in return, a gesture of honor, not despair. You opened the letter slowly. The words were few, formal, inevitable. He met his end with dignity. That was all they told you. That was all they thought you needed to know. For a samurai wife, widowhood wasn't freedom. It was confinement with a new name, Seiho, pure woman. You were expected to live out your days in quiet devotion to your husband's memory, maintaining his shrine, his possessions, and his reputation. To remarry was a dishonor. To show joy again was disrespect. Historians record that some samurai widows entered Buddhist convents, shaving their heads and devoting themselves to prayer. Others stayed in their homes, moving like ghosts through empty rooms that once echoed with command. Either way, life became a long act of remembrance. You began to wear subdued colors, gray, indigo, the muted shades of twilight. Your hair, once decorated with combs and pins, now tied back simply, hidden under a veil. Your laughter, if it ever escaped, startled even you. People praised your composure. They said, "She honors him well." But what they really meant was, "She has erased herself beautifully." At night, you'd sit beside the armor stand that still bore his helmet and sword. You'd polish them as you used to, though no one would ever wear them again. The sound of cloth against steel filled the silence like a heartbeat. Sometimes you spoke aloud, small things you never said when you lived. You were harsh, but not cruel. I never told you I admired your discipline. I wish you'd looked at me once, not as duty, but as person. No one was there to answer. And, somehow, that made it easier to speak. Historians still debate the concept of jigai, the ritual suicide of widowed samurai women. Some claim it was rare, exaggerated by legend. Others say it was common enough that every wife was trained to prepare the blade. A calm death was seen as the ultimate devotion, following your husband into eternity. You might have thought about it once. Not because you wanted to die, but because you wanted to rest, truly rest, without rules. But then you looked at your child, or your household, or the ancestors' altar, and knew that even death had to wait for permission. As the seasons turned, you learned to live in half-light. You spent mornings arranging incense at a shrine, afternoons copying Buddhist sutras by hand. Each character, each brushstroke, was a meditation, a way to keep the mind steady. The neighbors would visit sometimes, offering condolences long after the mourning period ended. They'd bow, compliment your discipline, and whisper, "She's an example to all wives." You bowed in return, thanked them softly, and poured more tea. You'd mastered the art of existing without taking up space. There were moments of strange peace. Watching snow fall in the courtyard, you'd think of impermanence, how everything, even sorrow, changes its shape. The monks were right, you realized, clinging causes suffering. And you, who had been trained your whole life to cling to duty, were finally learning how to let go. Not all at once, but quietly, like the sound of a candle burning itself away. One evening, you found a letter hidden among his things, a short note written years before, folded between old accounts. It read, "If I fall, do not follow me. The world still needs order. Guard in my place." You pressed the paper to your forehead, feeling something unexpected, permission. Perhaps not freedom, but something close. Historians sometimes romanticize the samurai widow as a symbol of eternal loyalty. But the truth was more human. You were lonely, You were tired, and you endured. And in enduring, you became invisible, but unbroken. So tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine that widow sitting beside the armor in the dim light of dusk. Her face calm, her hands folded in prayer. Outside, the world continues, soft and far away. And though no one calls her name anymore, she whispers it to herself, just once before sleep. Because before she was wife or widow or ghost, she was still someone. And that quiet truth is her final rebellion. History remembers the samurai wife as quiet. But silence doesn't mean weakness. It means calculation, the kind that moves mountains without a sound. Behind the paper screens, you learned how to influence without commanding, how to guide without appearing to lead. Men called it obedience. You called it art. Each gesture, each pause, each tone of voice could shift the balance of the household. You couldn't issue orders, but you could plant ideas. You couldn't debate openly, but you could reframe a story. And often, those who believed they led were following the invisible current you set. It was a different kind of swordsmanship, one fought with words, glances, and timing. In the tea room, your voice softened to the precise note that soothed tempers. During family meetings, your polite silence reminded others of their own arrogance. And when your husband faced a decision he couldn't untangle, you didn't advise. You asked questions that untied the knot for him. Would Lord Ito not see such a gesture as excessive? Perhaps the rice stores could reflect our gratitude better than coin. By morning, the idea was his. And that was how you survived. Historians sometimes call this the hidden power of samurai women. They note that wives often managed finances, arranged marriages for their children, even acted as diplomats when their husbands were away. But their achievements were rarely written down, because influence that isn't named looks like fate. You'd host tea ceremonies where nothing was accidental. The placement of the flower, the type of bowl, the sound of water pouring into the kettle, even a moment of silence between sips, all chosen carefully to convey balance and control. Guests left calm, convinced they'd experienced serenity. But what they'd really experienced was your mastery of atmosphere. At times, you helped resolve disputes between neighboring clans, though no one would ever credit you. When one lord's envoy visited, he arrived tense, prepared for hostility. By the time he left, he was laughing softly, cradling a cup of green tea you'd brewed yourself. The next week, a peace treaty was announced. Your husband believed it was his diplomacy. You smiled and let him believe it. Historians argue whether women, like you, shaped politics from the shadows or merely maintained order. But the truth is less romantic and more impressive. You made peace feel inevitable. You made chaos seem like an interruption in the natural rhythm of the house. And in a world obsessed with control, that kind of calm was power. Still, your strength came at a cost, because you couldn't show it. A woman praised for wisdom risked envy. A woman praised for influence risked danger. You learned to let men take the credit, because the credit wasn't the point, survival was. Sometimes, late at night, you'd smile to yourself at the irony. The same people who pitted your powerlessness were dancing unknowingly to your rhythm. There's a story of Lady Jukianai, a samurai matriarch from the 16th century, who ruled her clan's province through her son's name. Her letters were filled with humility, yet her commands moved hundreds of men. When scholars rediscovered her correspondence centuries later, they realized how much of Japan's stability had rested on unseen women like her. You might not rule provinces, but you ruled the air around you. And in a house built on honor, that was enough to shape the world. In quiet moments, you found small ways to keep your own identity alive. Writing poems no one would read. Painting cherry blossoms in ink, each petal an unspoken thought. Or playing the koto softly after everyone slept, the strings humming like memories beneath your fingertips. You could not shout your existence into history, but you could leave it behind, disguised as grace. One evening, while pouring tea for your husband and his guests, One of them said, "A woman's virtue is silence." You bowed politely, but as you lifted the teapot, you smiled faintly and replied, "And yet, without a woman's silence, how would any man ever hear himself think?" The guests laughed, unaware they'd been gently corrected. Your husband beamed at your wit, not realizing he'd been outmaneuvered. You'd said everything you ever wanted, without breaking a single rule. So, as sleep begins to gather around you, imagine the hush of that tea room, the faint fragrance of matcha, the gleam of lacquer bowls, and a woman sitting behind the paper screen, eyes calm, mind bright, holding an empire together with nothing but composure. She is unseen, but she sees everything, and that, not submission, is her secret strength. Not every samurai wife bowed her head and stayed behind the paper walls. Some picked up weapons, some rode into battle, and history, usually so fond of silence, couldn't quite erase them. When war tore through provinces and castles burned, women sometimes fought beside their husbands or led defenders when the men were gone. They were called onabigeisha, women of war. Their armor was lighter, their resolve heavier. You might have known their names whispered like legends. Tomo Guzan, who rode under Minamoto banners in the 12th century, wielding her naginata with such precision that even the fiercest men feared her. Or Nakano Takiko, who led her own battalion centuries later, fighting until the moment she fell, her hair unbound like fire. Historians debate whether these women were exceptions or symbols, rare sparks or hidden embers in a world of restraint. But the fact that they existed at all means the silence was never complete. You can picture Tomo Guzan, the white horse, the crimson armor, the moon reflecting off her blade. Chroniclers say she was beautiful, fearless, devoted to her lord. They also say she decapitated enemies twice her size without hesitation. When she vanished from records after one final battle, legend claimed she chose exile over submission. To the men who wrote those histories, her disappearance was fitting. To you, it was freedom. Perhaps, in another life, you might have been like her. You might have tied your hair high, donned armor, felt the weight of the naginata in your hands. Your body trained not for ceremony, but for defense. Not for servitude, but for survival. Even if you never fought, that warrior spirit lived quietly within you, honed by centuries of endurance. The difference between sword and silence, after all, was only where the blade was hidden. In times of siege, the line between wife and soldier blurred. When men fell, women took up bows on the castle walls. You'd see them, sleeves tucked, faces pale with determination, hurling stones or boiling water at advancing troops. Not for glory, for family. Not for conquest, for home. They're a record of the 1615 siege of Osaka Castle, where women fought beside their husbands. Some wore their wedding robes under armor, so that, if killed, they could die properly dressed. There's both beauty and horror in that detail, the blending of ceremony and combat. Even the quieter women, the ones history ignored, had small rebellions. One wife smuggled food to starving peasants during wartime and risked execution. Another hid her husband's political rival under the floorboards to spare him. Another bribed guards to save her son's tutor, accused falsely of treason. Their weapons weren't swords. They were courage, cunning, and compassion. But courage has many forms. Sometimes, it's the hand that hides bread instead of brandishing steel. Historians used to dismiss such stories as folklore, but modern scholars see them differently. They argue that these women were part of a lineage of quiet resistance, warriors not of blood, but of endurance. They didn't change the code, they outlasted it. And in surviving, they wrote a secret history of strength. At night, when the wind howled and the lanterns flickered, you'd think about those women. You'd imagine Tomo Guzan riding through fog, her expression calm, her heart steady. You'd whisper her name, not aloud but inside like a prayer. because she represented something forbidden yet undeniable: choice. You'd never raise a blade. But perhaps when you faced gossip, cruelty, or loss with unbroken composure, that was your own battle, invisible but no less brave. Even centuries later, their stories live in fragments of scrolls, inked by monks who didn't quite know how to categorize them. Were they sinners for breaking their place, or saints for defending it? No one agreed. But each brushstroke that recorded their existence defied the quiet death of memory. You wonder if one day, your name, or the name of someone like you, might survive the same way. A whisper between histories, proof that gentleness and strength can live in the same body. So, as you rest now, picture the battlefield under a pale dawn. Armored women ride through mist. Behind them, the smoke of burning castles fades into morning light. They're not remembered as often as the men, but they existed. They endured. And through them, every silent wife found a mirror. Because sometimes the fiercest warriors never hold a sword. They hold the world together with their bare, steady hands. Not every woman who lived under the samurai code wore silk or knelt on polished tatami. Some lived at its edges. The forgotten wives, the temple women, the ones who belonged to no clan and yet bore the same burdens in silence. Their world was smaller, their power thinner, their stories almost erased. But if you listen closely, you can still hear their footsteps on the worn temple stones. When wars ended and the peace of the Edo period spread across Japan, many samurai fell from grace. Without battles to fight, stipends shrank, and men who once commanded armies now swept temple courtyards for rice. Their wives followed them, into poverty, into obscurity, into lives stripped of honor's ornaments. You can picture them, washing robes in cold rivers, patching old kimonos, bowing to the same monks who once bowed to them. And yet, even in that humility, there is quiet dignity. They had been trained in restraint, and restraint, unlike silk, does not wear out. Historians record that widowed or impoverished samurai women often became temple attendants or joined Buddhist orders. Some were called AMA, nuns who shaved their heads and lived lives of discipline and simplicity. Others served as caretakers, maintaining the temple gardens or preparing meals for monks. But even there, hierarchy followed them. They were women of the world who sought redemption, never equals, always reminders of impermanence. Still, they found a strange peace among the scent of incense and the rhythm of chanting, a peace the old mansions never offered. At dawn, you'd hear the temple bell. Its sound rolled over the valley, deep and steady, like a breath the earth itself was taking. You'd rise, sweep the stone path, and bow to the morning sun. No servants, no gossip, no husband to obey. Just the sound of your broom against the gravel, tracing circles of calm into the dust. Maybe this was freedom, even if it wore the robes of service. But not all women reached the temples. Some became outcasts, Ronin's wives, or Yujo, women of the pleasure quarters, trapped between survival and shame. When their husbands lost rank or honor, their families cast them out. The samurai world had no place for the fallen, and so they built one for themselves. You can imagine a woman once noble, now living near the riverbanks of Kyoto, her old kimono sleeves mended and faded. She tells fortunes to travelers, sings songs she once played for lords. Each note carries both memory and defiance. Her laughter is softer now, but it's hers. No master, no code, no clan. Historians rarely mention them because they don't fit the story of honor. But they were the living proof that honor was only possible when someone else was allowed to fall. In temple ledgers, some women appear without family names. Their records are brief. Widow, age 36. Devout, offered prayers for the departed. Nothing more. But each stroke of the monk's brush was a resurrection. For a moment, their existence was written back into the world. You wonder how many others vanished completely, not in death but in forgetting. Sometimes, when temple monks wrote poems about impermanence, they compared fallen samurai families to cherry blossoms in late wind. But the wives? They compared them to moss, unseen, persistent, thriving even in shadow. You can see it, can't you? A courtyard of stone lanterns, moss glistening in morning dew. A woman kneeling to scrub the step, her shaved head glinting in sunlight. The air filled with the scent of wet earth and incense. No one praises her. No one sees her. But still she cleans. Still she prays. Still she lives. Historians still argue whether temple life liberated or confined women. Perhaps both. Perhaps freedom and restraint aren't opposites at all. Perhaps they're two sides of endurance. For you, living there, freedom wouldn't feel like rebellion. It would feel like peace that doesn't need permission. And outside those temple walls, in villages and river towns, other women, forgotten wives, outcasts, storytellers, carried fragments of the samurai world like ghosts wearing borrowed clothes. They remembered the silence, but not the fear. They remembered the code, but not the obedience. They survived, and that survival, quiet and stubborn, was its own revolution. So, as you rest now, imagine the temple bell ringing across the valley. Its echo stretches through centuries, past all the names history forgot. Somewhere, a woman's hand pauses mid-sweep, listening. She closes her eyes, and for the first time, perhaps she smiles. Because no one is watching. And that, finally, is freedom. Beauty, for a samurai wife, wasn't a gift. It was a duty, one polished daily until it gleamed like lacquer. You didn't wake to the mirror, you woke for it. Each strand of hair, each brush of powder, each layer of silk carried meaning, weight, and expectation. You were an emblem, not a person. Your appearance was the first language your household spoke to the world. In the mornings, attendants heated water in bronze basins, steam softening the air as you sat before the mirror stand. Your reflection shimmered faintly in the polished metal. Not quite clear, as if reminding you that identity here was always blurred. You powdered your face white with asheroi, a symbol of purity and distance. It was the color of porcelain, the color of ghosts. Then came the ritual of teeth blackening, ohaguro. A paste made of iron filings and vinegar painted your smile into darkness. To outsiders it might seem grotesque, but in your world it meant loyalty, adulthood, composure. White teeth were for children or the wild. Blackened teeth belonged to women who obeyed. Historians still debate how women felt about this ritual. Some diaries describe pride. Others, disgust hidden behind elegance. One woman wrote, "I painted my teeth as custom demands, but every morning I wash my mouth in secret water." Perhaps you did too. Hair was another battlefield. Hours spent arranging the marmage bun, a sleek, tight coil pinned into place with lacquered combs. It had to be perfect, unmoving, even in summer heat. A single loose strand could be read as laziness, or worse, rebellion. And the kimono, layers upon layers of silk that spoke without words. The outer robe declared your family's wealth. The inner layers whispered of taste and discipline. The colors changed with the seasons. Pale plum in spring, indigo in summer, rust and gold in autumn, ash gray in winter. Even beauty had to follow the calendar. Historians note that in Edo, Japan, cosmetics were philosophy. The white face represented detachment from earthly passions. The red lips, the fleeting nature of life. The painted eyebrows, the calm control of emotion. You didn't decorate yourself. You erased yourself gracefully. In a world where men fought with swords, women fought with surfaces. Your armor was your appearance. And like armor, it was heavy. There were days when the ritual exhausted you. You'd look at the mirror and see not your face, but the reflection of everyone else's expectations. Mother-in-law, husband, clan, society. You'd think, I wonder what my real face looks like now. Then you'd smile politely and finish the powdering. Because in this house, self-expression was rebellion disguised as vanity. When guests visited, your presence was a display of calm perfection. They'd compliment your elegance, not realizing how many invisible hours went into each movement. How long you'd trained your hands to pour tea without trembling, your steps to glide rather than walk. To them, beauty was effortless. To you, it was discipline. One evening, you caught your reflection in the still surface of the garden pond. The moonlight made your face glow, white, serene, mask-like. A carp swam beneath, distorting your image with ripples. For a moment, you almost preferred that blurred, imperfect alive. Historians found poems written by women of your era, comparing their makeup rituals to prayer. Powder the skin like forgiveness. Comb the hair like confession. Paint the lips like truth disguised. Maybe that's what it was, a ritual of devotion, not to gods, but to the fragile order that kept your world standing. Still, you found small rebellions. Choosing a slightly brighter shade of silk than propriety allowed, letting a lock of hair escape on purpose, or wearing a faint scent of plum oil that lingered too long. Tiny gestures, but they reminded you that your body was still yours, at least in secret. Sometimes at night, after the household slept, you'd wash your face and stare at your bare reflection in a bowl of water. No powder, no paint, no perfection, just skin and eyes and breath. You'd touch your cheek and think, there I am. And then, before dawn, you'd begin again. So as you drift tonight, imagine the slow ritual of beauty turned into meditation. The soft brush against skin, the scent of plum and iron, the glow of lanterns over silk, the sound of your own breath beneath it all. You aren't vain. You're surviving through art. Because in a world that worshipped the surface, the samurai wife mastered the art of turning masks into mirrors. In a world ruled by discipline, even grace was a subject of study. As a samurai wife, you were expected to be beautiful, yes, but also cultured, the living embodiment of refinement. Your husband fought with a sword. You fought with elegance. Your education began early, in childhood, before marriage turned knowledge into silence. You learned how to hold a brush before you could hold chopsticks properly, how to sit without shifting, how to pour tea without spilling, how to smile just enough that no one could accuse you of pride. But your greatest lesson wasn't posture or calligraphy. It was control, a voice of thought of self. Historians describe the samurai woman's education as a mirror of her husband's. The same discipline, channeled into different arts. He studied tactics and Confucian ethics. You studied poetry, painting, and reiji, the proper behavior that ordered society. Every action, from how you lifted a scroll to how you greeted a guest, was a verse in the poem of daily life. Perfection wasn't optional. It was expected. Your writing table was your battlefield. The brush was your weapon. Ink and paper, your tools of preservation. You practice kana, the soft, flowing script reserved for women, elegant and subtle. Each stroke demanded balance between firmness and fluidity. To write well was to reveal your mind without breaking its calm surface. Sometimes when you wrote poems to accompany gifts, a fan, a piece of silk, a box of sweets, you'd hide messages and metaphors. The moon reflects upon still water. Only the clouds know it's weeping. He might never notice the sadness behind the grace. But the act of writing, it was rebellion enough. You learned the kodo too, the 13-stringed instrument of refinement. Your teacher, an old woman with hands like willow roots, would tap your fingers lightly when they trembled. The string is not sound, she said. The silence between the notes is. You realized then that silence, when deliberate, was not emptiness, it was meaning. A truth you'd already known your whole life. There were days when you practiced tea ceremony for hours, kneeling until your legs went numb. Every motion, folding the cloth, turning the cup, bowing, had to be exact. To outsiders, it looked simple. To you, it was meditation disguised as hospitality. When guests praise your serenity, they didn't see the muscle memory behind it. You smiled, bowed, and thought, if only peace could be learned like this, one measured gesture at a time. Historians note that through such arts, women shaped the culture of Japan more deeply than warlords ever did. While men built castles, women built civility. While men argued over land, women defined what grace meant. And in that grace, they slipped their names quietly into eternity. Still, learning wasn't just for display. In private, it became a kind of rescue, a way to stay alive inside your own mind. Writing gave structure to emotions you could never speak. Music offered freedom in the notes between obedience. Calligraphy turned restraint into beauty. You couldn't leave your home, but through art, you could travel inward. And that journey had no gate, no lord, no code. Sometimes late at night, you'd sit by a lamp, practicing brushstrokes long after duties ended. The ink scent mixed with candle smoke. Outside, the crickets sang. You wrote the character for patience again and again until the lines flowed effortlessly. Then, perhaps by mistake or intention, you added one stroke too many, turning it into heart. It was a secret no one else would see, a quiet confession only the paper would keep. Historians find such small acts of self-expression in women's diaries and letters. Minor deviations, hidden symbols, the soft footprints of individuality in a culture that prized uniformity. They show that knowledge didn't make women compliant. It made them clever. Education had taught you grace. Grace, in turn, had taught you survival. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine the faint music of the koto echoing in a dim tatami room. The brush strokes on paper still wet. The taste of tea, earthy and warm. You bow, pour, and write, not for approval but for presence. Because even when history forgot your name, the ink remembered your hand. Peace, the dream that men fought centuries for, arrived at last. But for the wives of samurai, it came wrapped in monotony. The wars ended. The swords hung idle on the walls. The great battles of Japan's past became ghost stories told to restless boys. And in the quiet that followed, something unexpected grew. Boredom. Your husband no longer rode to war. He attended endless meetings at the Lord's estate, managing taxes, ceremonies, paperwork, the new wars of the pen. You stayed home, surrounded by stillness, so heavy it hummed. The days stretched like silk unrolling without end. You did everything right, oversaw servants, arranged flowers, checked the ledgers. Yet time itself seemed to forget you existed. Historians call this the paradox of Edo peace, a nation without battle but filled with invisible tension. The warrior class, built for chaos, was left to polish armor that would never see combat. And their wives? They polished composure that had nowhere to shine. You walked the same corridors each morning. Tatami, shoji, tatami, the same corners, the same flicker of sunlight through paper. You'd pause by the garden pond, watching the koi swirl in patient circles. You'd think they live in peace too. But do they know it's a prison? When you were younger, you'd envied safety. Now you saw that stillness could feel like drowning. No letters came from the battlefield anymore. No fears, no triumphs, only repetition. The endless perfection of nothing happening. Even festivals lost their color. The same music, the same polite laughter, the same painted faces repeating the same compliments. You'd bow, smile, answer correctly, and feel yourself fading behind a mask. Historians still debate whether Edo's peace liberated or suffocated women. Some records speak of comfort, stable households, prosperity, long life. Others whisper of melancholy, wives falling ill not from disease, but from emptiness. Doctors called it kino yamai, a sickness of the spirit. You didn't need a doctor to recognize it. You felt it in your bones, the ache of stillness too long endured. To fill the hours, you turned to hobbies, poetry, ikebana, brushwork. But even those became routine, each petal arrangement and poem constrained by rules older than you. You wondered whether creativity was possible without rebellion. Sometimes you'd stand by the window, watching smoke from a neighbor's hearth drift into the gray sky. That thin column of movement, so small, so free, became your favorite sight. One afternoon, while folding linens, you found your husband's sword tucked deep in a chest. The metal gleamed faintly through the cloth wrap. You unwrapped it and felt its weight in your hands. It was colder than you remembered. You hadn't touched it in years. You traced the edge lightly, remembering all it once represented: fear, power, fate. Now it was an ornament like the painted screens, a relic of a world that demanded meaning through danger. And here you were, surrounded by safety that felt just as deadly. You wrapped the sword again and placed it back. But that night, you dreamed of drawing it, not to fight, but simply to hear the sound. Historians often praise the Edo period for refinement, but refinement without purpose can become paralysis. Some women turned to literature, reading tales of ghosts, lovers, or rebellious heroines. Others turned inward, their diaries filled with soft despair written in the same graceful hand used for prayers. One wrote, "I live as the moon does, changing but unseen, lighting rooms that do not belong to me." You understood her. Too much peace, you realized, is its own kind of exile. And yet, amid the emptiness, you found a strange calm. Without war, no one died suddenly. Children grew old enough to laugh. The garden bloomed reliably each spring. You learned to find meaning in small things: the pattern of rain on the veranda, the whisper of silk as you moved through the hall. Maybe peace didn't have to be exciting. Maybe it just had to be endured gracefully. You poured another cup of tea, steam curling in quiet spirals. It wasn't glory, but it was life. And for the first time, that felt enough. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine the stillness of that age. A world without battle cries. A garden without fire. A woman sitting beneath a cherry tree in bloom, neither happy nor sad, simply breathing, existing, surviving peace. Because sometimes the hardest thing to survive isn't war. It's the calm that follows. Change, when it finally came, didn't arrive with war drums or shouts. It came quietly, like wind sneaking through the cracks in the paper walls. At first, it was just a rumor. Strange ships seen on the horizon, sails black with smoke. Then came foreign merchants, odd faces, words that twisted like waves. And behind them, a slow unraveling of everything the samurai world thought eternal. You'd notice it in small ways. A new coin, a different fabric at the market, a curious foreign trinket passed between servants. The elders dismissed it. "Japan stands unshaken," they said. But the air smelled different, like iron, salt, and questions. Your husband, now gray at the temples, muttered about Western influence, about guns replacing honor. He said the new lords had no dignity, just money. And you wondered, silently, if that might not be such a terrible thing after all. Historians describe the late Edo era as a time of contradictions. The old code cracking, the new world seeping in. The samurai class, once divine, found itself trapped between nostalgia and irrelevance. They still wore swords, but their power was vanishing. You could feel it in your house. The way the servants spoke more freely, the way the younger generation laughed louder, less afraid. And for the first time in your life, that didn't seem wrong. You caught your daughter once, hair unbound, reading a forbidden Western novel by candlelight. When you startled her, she bowed deeply, expecting scolding. But you didn't raise your voice. Instead, you asked, "What is it about?" She hesitated, then whispered, "A woman who leaves her husband to see the sea." The image struck you like lightning. A woman leaving, not dying, simply leaving. You took the book from her gently and returned it to her after a pause. Keep it, you said. Just hide it well. That night, you couldn't sleep. The idea of a world where women could walk away without disgrace. It felt like fiction, yet also like a prophecy. You lay awake listening to the rain tapping the paper screens, imagining it washing away centuries of silence. Historians say that as Western trade opened Japan, new philosophies trickled in. Individualism, equality, freedom. Not all welcome them. But for women like you, those words whispered from the future like distant bells. At temple gatherings, younger wives began to speak a little more boldly. They asked questions about inheritance, about learning, even about travel. Their elders frowned, but their voices didn't fade. You watched them with quiet awe, remembering your own youth, when questions like that lived only in your dreams. The old rituals began to lose their weight. The Ana Daigaku was still recited, but fewer women listened. Tea ceremonies became less about perfection and more about conversation. Even beauty changed, lighter powders, unpainted teeth, simpler hair. It was as if the masks were slipping off, one by one. And behind those masks, faces you'd never seen before, honest, curious, alive. Once, while visiting a friend, you overheard her daughter say, "I do not wish to marry a samurai. I wish to learn medicine." The room went still. Old women gasped softly, like sparrows startled by thunder. But your friend, her eyes weary, her mouth thin, didn't scold. She just nodded. Then study hard. That moment felt like history turning a page. You thought of your younger self, kneeling before your husband, bowing to rules written by men who never imagined your thoughts. And you smiled, because even if your time had been caged, the door was finally opening for those who came next. Historians argue that the fall of the samurai era was tragedy, but maybe, for its women, it was liberation disguised as loss. The old world decayed, not with fire, but with quiet relief. You walked through your garden one last time before the estate was sold. The tatami smelled of age, the paper doors of sun. You touched the wooden beam, the same one you'd polished for decades, and whispered, "Thank you for sheltering me." Then you turned, and for once, didn't bow to the past. So as you drift tonight, imagine the paper walls trembling in soft wind. Lantern light flickering, shadows shifting. Beyond them, not war, not fear, but something new, gentle, uncertain, free. You may not live to see it, but you've already felt it. The slow heartbeat of a world learning to breathe again. The world that once caged you is fading now, dissolving into the mists of memory. The swords have rusted. The crests on the old banners are frayed and forgotten. The mansions have turned to museums. But your story, the story of every samurai wife, still lingers in the quiet spaces between the pages of history. You sit by the paper window one last time, the night breeze gentle against your cheek. The garden outside is overgrown, the pond silent, the cherry tree aged and twisted. And yet, the moonlight still falls the same way it always did, soft, forgiving, eternal. You close your eyes and listen. Somewhere, a distant temple bell tolls. Each note feels like a heartbeat echoing through centuries. You think of all the versions of yourself that once lived here. The obedient bride, the silent caretaker, the widow who whispered to armor and ghosts, the quiet strategist behind the screen, the woman who endured peace and longed for meaning. Each of them still walks these halls with you, their steps woven into the tatami like threads of memory. Historians will write of the samurai age as a story of men, their battles, their codes, their deaths. But you know better. You know that the empire of silence was built and kept alive by women who learned to bear it gracefully. Without wives, there were no heirs. Without mothers, no warriors. Without calm hands behind the paper walls, no order in the chaos. You were the stillness that allowed the storm to exist. And the storm never realized it owed you everything. You remember your daughter, who once read by candlelight, now grown, She writes letters freely, signs her name boldly, studies the new arts of the Meiji world. She wears no powder, blackens no teeth, bows only when she chooses. When she visits, her laughter fills the house like music from another time. You watch her with pride, not envy, because you understand that every small obedience, every silent tear, every day you kept the world from collapsing, was so that she could stand unbound. The lantern beside you flickers, the flame small but steady. You bow to it, not as ritual but as farewell. You think of your husband, your home, the centuries of tradition that once felt immovable. You smile softly. Everything changes, and that, you realize now, is the truest form of peace. The night grows deeper. Your breath slows. The paper screens whisper with the wind. You feel no fear, only release. The life you lived, the endless rituals, the hidden strength, the quiet wisdom, was never wasted. It was preparation for this moment of perfect stillness. So, as you rest now, imagine yourself stepping through those shoji doors one last time. The garden awaits, silver with moonlight. The air is cool, the stars soft, and countless above. You bow, not to duty, not to history, not to men. You bow to yourself, to the woman who endured, who adapted, who lived fully in the spaces between obedience and grace. The crickets sing, the wind sighs through bamboo, and the world, for once, feels balanced. You exhale a long, steady breath that carries 500 years of silence out into the night. There's nothing left to prove, nothing left to hold. Only peace, only sleep, sweet dreams,